Are you worried about the future? If so, I can pretty much guarantee you that no matter how concerned your outlook is, it's still brightly sunny compared to longtime contrarian macro analyst Marc Faber, editor and publisher of the Gloom Doom Boom report. Using a global perspective and millennia of historical precedent, Marc sees challenging times ahead. And safety warning, if you're frightened easily, you'll want to fully strap in before watching further.
Maybe for a while, like during the Bolshevik Revolution and maybe during the French Revolution, maybe for a while, it looks better because of money printing and fiscal deficits, but in the long run, it will lead to disaster.
Welcome to Wealthion. I'm Wealthion founder Adam Taggart, welcoming you back for another week of making sense of money and the markets. Today, we're zooming out to look at the macro situation from a global perspective. Joining us from Hong Kong is Marc Faber, PhD in economics, author, and longtime editor and publisher of the Gloom Boom Doom report. Marc's well known for his global investment view, his skepticism of central planners, and his bold and often contrarian predictions. Marc, I just want to thank you so much for staying up so late in your evening to join us for this program.
My pleasure, no problem. Actually, I live in Thailand in the north in Chiang Mai.
In Chiang Mai, okay. Well, I know it's still late there, so thank you.
I still have an office in Hong Kong, but when I'm not traveling, I stay in Chiang Mai. And now with all the restrictions, we can't travel anywhere.
I like to start every one of these interviews not introducing any biases on my end. So if we could just start with this question, what is your current assessment of today's global economy and financial markets?
Well, I think I could give a speech for 3 hours about the state of the global economy, because as you know, we have different countries and different countries are moving in different directions. And we have different financial markets, and some markets are going up and some markets are going down. So it's a complex issue, but in general, if we look at the capitalistic system that we had for the last 200 years, and the socialistic system and communism that we had, especially after 1918 in Russia, the Russian Revolution, and then later on communism in the Soviet Union, and then after the fall of the nationalists in China, we had the communists in China in 1949. The nationalists had to flee to Taiwan and so forth. So if I look at this world and I look at the opening of countries like China and Russia and so forth, obviously we had huge changes over the last 40 years. But one thing that I have to point out to all your viewers is that when I first traveled to socialist countries in the 60s in Eastern Europe and later in 1980 to Russia, and at about the same time to China and a bit later to Vietnam, what was striking is how much poverty socialist countries were able to generate, while Western countries, including the US and Western European countries, through the system of free markets and capitalism, had all prospered relative to the rest of the world. And if we look at the world today, we never in history, thanks to capitalism, had such a low poverty rate around the world relative to the world's population. Most people today are much better off than they were 30, 40 years ago. I'm not saying everybody. In the US and in Europe, we have statistics that show that people who now reach 35 years of age, they are poorer and earn less in real terms, inflation adjusted, than their parents. So I think we have to consider that if we have this move to the left, that to my surprise, young people want, They want the government to do more. They want the government to regulate more and to intervene more. With all this move to the left, we will have very disappointing economic growth rates, and the standards of living of most people who follow these left-wing policies that lead to disaster, economic and social disaster, that these policies are, of course, ill-conceived and should be rethought very carefully by the voters. The government doesn't do anything that the voters want. The government is an own institution. The bureaucrats take measures that voters mostly wouldn't want to have implemented. So let's leave the government out. The government no longer represents people. The government is evil. And as long as we have this trend, I think the economies will, maybe for a while, like during the Bolshevik Revolution and maybe during the French Revolution, maybe for a while, it looks better because of money printing and fiscal deficits, but in the long run, it will lead to disaster. So that is my view of the global economy. And we have already a slowdown now in the global economy.
Well, we do. Wow. Okay, so that was a great exposition to start this with. And if I could just sum up, you're saying, look, history has shown us that the more totalitarian, the more socialist the state becomes, generally the worse the population seems to fare. And if I can put words in your mouth, it sounds like you're saying you're becoming concerned that you're seeing more of those type of policies taking over, and that makes you concerned about future growth prospects for the global economy. Did I summarize that relatively well?
About the freedom of people and about their standards of living. I'm not talking about myself, you understand? I live comfortably on a property in Thailand, so I have no particular agenda or objective that I want to follow. I was asked about the global economy, and I gave you my assessment, having lived through countries that were in the stage of socialism and communism. And I saw the disasters that these interventionist governments brought about. The planning economy, where a group of arrogant bureaucrats, as we have today in the US and some European countries, they think that they know and that they should take economic policy measures.
Well, it's exactly that global perspective, which is why I wanted to have you on here. So I so appreciate you sharing it. And you said something that I want to kind of try to use an analog here, and you tell me if it's appropriate or not. But when Hugo Chavez took over in Venezuela, he did a lot of raiding of the wealth of the country, and for a while everybody felt great, right? But then the unsustainability of those policies kind of caught up with things, and of course we all know where Venezuela is today. Do you see an analog there with all the money printing and stimulus that's being pursued so aggressively in the major economies right now?
Well, in particular with the period that covered the French Revolution, 1789 to about 1796. It was a period where first they printed money through the so-called assignat system, and it led to some near-term prosperity. But then inflation caught up and prices went up. It's like now in the US, I would say that the majority of people, say more than 50%, they had now price increases of food, energy, healthcare, educational costs, rents, and the affordability that went down. In other words, they had cost increases of the cost of living that vastly exceeds their wage gains, vastly. So in real terms, inflation adjusted, their standards of living will go down. The standards of living of people like Jeff Bezos, and I'm not criticizing him, I'm just stating the standards of these people of living is vastly increasing because their companies are doing very well in an environment where you're closing down small shops.
Absolutely. So, as we, Bloomberg just published an article today showing that the cost of a house in the U.S. is up 23% year over year. You mentioned a bunch of other essentials for living: food, healthcare, rents. They're all up double digits in the past year. But real wages in no way, shape, or form are matching pace to this, right? So, a question I ask a lot here is sort of how much longer can the average citizen stand this, and when do the torches and pitchforks come out? But do you see going forward from here in the major economies like the US, like Europe, are just sort of ever higher prices and ever rising inflation? Is that just going to be the new normal going forward? Or do you see them hitting some sort of deflationary limit at some point here where we see a big contraction?
Well, this is a very good question, and we don't really know the answer. Based on the completely incompetence of the bureaucrats that sit at central banks, who have zero historical knowledge, zero business experience, but sit in glass buildings, building all kinds of models they themselves don't really understand, and to then take the monetary measures that essentially have since the 1980s led to larger and larger stimuli packages and larger monetary ease, that these people will continue to print money. And if the inflation picks up more, and at the same time, as I suggested, the economy weakens, in other words, you have a situation of inflation and economic weakness, they will say, these academics that are overpaid and do nothing and know nothing, that these academics will tell the people, well, we didn't print enough. I guarantee you this is going to be the case. And I followed bureaucrats for a long time because I'm interested in history. The three latest Fed chairmen, Bernanke, Yellen, and Powell, are about the lowest grade bureaucrats I've seen in history.
Wow, that's quite a claim.
Monetary policies.
So,
or they're just lackeys. You understand? There may be slaves of someone behind them who tells them, "You do this." That is what I suspect.
Okay, so it sounds like you see, and it's no real surprise, right? Whenever anybody in government is faced with a decision today, they are largely always going to choose to inflate because it gives a chance at least of kicking the can down the road a bit. Where if you tighten, you immediately get negative response from the people who are losing their jobs, from the companies that are shutting down, et cetera. So I get it. A bureaucrat's gonna bureaucrat. Most likely they're gonna take the easy way out and print. All right, so
there could be an exception to this rule.
And that would be?
But it's difficult to envision a situation where the US dollar would collapse against other currencies. You understand? If it collapsed against, say, European currencies or the Japanese yen and so forth, then maybe there would be pressure on the US to actually tighten by the international holders of government bonds in the US, that could be essentially the case. But the other central banks do the same. They also print money. And so what we will have is a depreciation of paper money overall in the world, not just in the US, but overall, people who hold cash. When I grew up in my grandfather's household, what was safe is to hold cash with a bank. Nowadays, to hold cash is not safe because your deposit rates, say 6 months deposit rates in the US are less than 0.5%. And the inflation, as the government publishes, is more than 4%. So you have negative real interest rates of more than 3.5%. But this is what the government is publishing. The reality is that the inflation at the present time, and I'm not saying it will continue forever at this rate, it may accelerate, it may come down, but at the present time, inflation in the US, depending on your situation in life, is being, say, between 4.5% to 10%, in my view.
Well, I think anybody at least living in the US over the past year, I mentioned some of those double-digit increases in the essentials of living, they would agree with you. It definitely feels much more closer to 10% than 4%. And I think you were being generous by saying that banks will give you a 0.5% return. In most cases, I think it's substantially less than that right now. So
yes, I agree. In Switzerland, we have negative interest rates. In Germany as well.
Yeah, you've got negative nominal interest rates, which is just
sure.
mind-blowing, right?
Yes.
Exactly. All right. So the rational
central
response...
bankers are criminals. They steal, they expropriate honest people's savings by implementing zero and less than zero interest rates.
Well, so I want to get to the actionable part of the story, but you just put your finger on something that I talk about a lot here, and I'd love to get your opinion on it, which is right now, in terms of the official narrative, the central banks are the heroes in the story, right? They are the ones providing the essential liquidity that kept the economy from staying in recession when the pandemic hit. They are keeping rates low to be able to help people afford their mortgages. I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying this is the storyline.
I understand.
Right?
I understand.
So what is it going to take for the masses to start seeing the central banks as the villain in this story?
Well, I think a lot of people see them already in an unfavorable light, but you have to understand. In academia, let's say you're a professor at the university. The question is, you want to keep your job or you want to get sacked? You want to keep your job, shut up and just accept. You're an employee of the Federal Reserve. Better shut up. Don't expose anything that could be wrong. You're working for Chase Manhattan Bank or JP Morgan or whatever it is. Shut up. The best nowadays in the current job situation that we have and in the current politically correct atmosphere, just shut up. Because if you expose the villains and you tell the truth, they're going to shut you up. A lot of academics have been sacked because they made some remarks that were inconvenient to their colleagues. And in academia, in business, we have business rivalries and so forth, and people compete with each other. But in academia, there is much more jealousy among the people sitting at the university. They all hate each other. They hate each other. Today's economists, how many economists have you heard recently quote David Ricardo, Adam Smith, Schumpeter, or even a more recent economist like Milton Friedman, who argued for freedom and capitalism and small governments and free to choose? They never quote him. They hate him. because he argued for small governments and for the government to stay out of the way of the economy. It's a disaster. The level of economics in terms of sophistication, unlike, say, mathematics and physics that have made huge strides forward over the last 30 years, in economics, we've gone back to practically the Stone Ages.
Okay. So we've got a regressive academic environment that is ruled by the tyranny of the majority here. And I've got to think we also have on the business side, the corporate side, and the political side, we have the powerful players who are making tons of money from their unfair advantage right now, feeding from the trough, and they don't want the system to change, correct?
No, they don't want. This is a perfect system for academia. They can be incompetent at the Fed, then they leave the Fed, then they advise a hedge fund, and that's it. And they earn much more. Or they write a book by a ghostwriter.
Yeah, it's that revolving door.
I can tell you,
Ben Bernanke going to Citadel.
I know several former Fed employees, Fed voting members. Larry Lindsay, he was sacked by Greenspan in the late 1990s because he opposed to the easy monetary policies.
All right. Well, look, so let's get to the practical side then. So we've got this this power structure that you think is going to continue to just debase currencies going forward. And I get the logic, it's hard to argue with. So the rational investor should then want to put their capital into assets that cannot be, their intrinsic value cannot be inflated away. Obviously, the mind immediately goes to precious metals. Love to hear your thoughts on them. And then are there any other asset classes that you think provide a safer haven for capital than the traditional cash, obviously, but even maybe equities and whatnot at these high prices?
Well, I wished it was as simple as you pointed out, Adam, but the complication arises that with the current policies, the government will sooner or later run kind of out of money, you understand? And then you have to take the money from somewhere and get the financial conditions again in good order, certainly compared to other countries. And so the taxation will go up. You understand? That is usually
Absolutely.
step one, printing money. Step two, the people that enjoyed the money printing, you start taking away something. So you have sort of a wealth tax, or you impose duties. The way the political system has been in the US, all tax increases have fallen on the middle class and the lower middle class and the poor people. It never falls on the 100 richest families. The tax cuts always benefit the 100 richest families, and the tax increases hurt the poor people. So, but in future that may change, you understand? We have huge political changes, not just in the US, but elsewhere. And we have these lefties and so forth. So I wouldn't rule out that it will become quite bad. Say, I have assets. Okay, I have assets in real estate, I have assets in precious metals and in some stocks. Because in Europe, if I can get companies with a dividend of 3-4%, and the cash has a negative yield, then the companies with a 3-4% yield over 10 years will go up by 30% if everything stays more or less the same, whereas cash will lose value. Anyway, and I have also precious metals that I said, real estate, stocks, and some bonds. I have high yield bonds in emerging economies. But my concern is that one day the government will come and say, well, Mr. Faber, first of all, maybe you have too many assets, we need to take something away from you. So we'll take 50%. And number two, Mr. Faber, I think it would be good to send you to a re-education camp, so that you can be in peace and rethink the world according to our socialist ideologies. And so
Right.
the government, you may look at me with big eyes about sending people to camps. Well, they already closed your business. They closed. Millions of people in the world lost their small shop, lost their hairdresser salon, the tattoo salon, everything. These were small entrepreneurs that don't have a lot of capital behind them. And so they lost their jobs. They lost their businesses. Small restaurants, coffee shops, everything. Never before in history has a government taken these type of draconian measures. And this in a system that claims, oh, we have democracy and therefore we have freedom. BS. The democracy was hijacked and has restricted people's freedoms.
What I love about you, Mark, is you are crystal clear on your thoughts. There's no there's no questioning what you think about the situation. So here it's clear that you predict tighter government control going forward as the system begins to break under its unsustainability. You foresee that the leadership is going to basically become more extortionary in terms of the demands it places on the populace to make up for the difference. And eventually it could get as bad as you're saying, as confiscatory taxes, business shutdowns, et cetera, whatever. So just trying to keep our viewers from sticking our heads fully in the oven. What type of steps do you recommend for the concerned investor listening to this, right, who doesn't want to become collateral damage to the ongoing process of currency devaluation, and perhaps has some concerns about risk confiscation, whether through taxes or more brutal forces? Do you have any advice for those people?
Well, I think that in life, if I look at people who were under extreme stress for extended periods of time, to be realistic was the better attitude towards the difficulties than to just say, oh, I hope it will get better. Do you understand? I think we need to realistically appraise the situation. And instead of saying it will get better, also consider that it may get much worse, as Mr. Faber thinks. And under the condition of much worse, you have to say to yourself, okay, all of us will endure a more challenging environment for our standard of living. So what precautions do I take? Do I do nothing? Or do I say, okay, it will get much worse. In this case, I better have another beer or another smoke or another joint. You understand? These are things, if you have money, instead of being stingy and saving everything, maybe you should start to enjoy a little bit your life, because it may get much worse. And forget about traveling anytime soon. You may be able to travel, but under very difficult conditions and so forth, and under a lot of headache that may make your trip unpleasant. So I would say financially, I'm of course in favor of owning precious metals. That there's no question about it, that precious metals are an avenue to maintain your purchasing power. But it is not guaranteed that they will not be taken away from you. That is a risk. Also, your shareholdings could be taken away from you in different ways, as well as your cryptocurrencies and so forth. in the French Revolution, about which I'm writing at the present time, they didn't take your gold and silver away, but they declared that anyone who accepts gold and silver as payment will be put to the guillotine, will be sent to the guillotine.
You couldn't use it on the free market under
Yes.
risk of death. Yeah.
So the first advice I have for your viewers is once to get from Google's a picture of a guillotine, because it's not particularly pleasant to be taken to the guillotine. But in France, in the French Revolution, they actually took most of the original revolutionaries. The revolutionaries in France were not simple people. They were not uneducated people. They were aristocrat, highly intelligent people. They took them to the guillotine themselves.
All right, Mark, remember I told you to help me get the people's heads out of the oven, not further in, but I get your point there. And I'm going to put some words in your mouth. Tell me if they're wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is, in addition to some of the financial steps, and I want you to share any more that you have, like own some precious metals, but you're really saying, invest in resilience, which is a theme that I and others have talked a lot about as being an important component of wealth, because the money, there's no guarantee the money is going to come even under the best of scenarios, right? But you're saying, look, times might get tougher, investing in your emotional resilience beforehand so that you can react to the adversity rather than get crushed by it would be good. I see you nodding here. And then there's another important form of resilience as well, which is social resilience, right? Which is really investing in the relationships around you so that if times indeed get tougher, you're not a lone wolf trying to, fend the pack off by yourself. You've actually got people that you have trusted relationships with where you're supporting each other during the tough times as opposed to turning on each other. Would you agree with that? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. The problem in periods of extreme hardship, people turn against each other. That's why there were always informers and denouncers and so forth throughout, periods of hardship. But in general, your assessment is correct. And number two, I would say the best is to diversify, because you understand what usually happens in financial stress is the imposition of foreign exchange controls. You are no longer allowed to invest outside the US or
you can't get your money out,
Japan and so forth. And I think it's very careless of anyone who has assets to only hold assets in one country. I think for me, it's incomprehensible, because the people that were the richest people in Russia and Eastern Europe, when the communists came, they lost everything. And the last Tsar, who was actually a relatively innocent bystander, he was not an evil man. And his children, they were all slaughtered by the communists.
All right, so important point there, which is consider diversifying
internationally.
Yeah, so, and I would imagine you would say diversification by asset class and then diversification by geography on top of that.
Correct, but the diversity by geography has to take into account that if you hold assets, say you're an American, you hold assets in Asia, the custody shouldn't be in the US, because the US government can then force to sell it, you understand, to liquidate it. But even if you hold it in another jurisdiction, if they put the knife on your head and say, look, or they put on the knife on your girlfriend or daughter's head, and they say to you, you either bring the assets back or we slaughter you. This happened to the most famous philosopher of the 20th century, Wittgenstein. The family had a huge fortune in gold parked in a Swiss bank. And because Wittgenstein, although he was he was Catholic, okay? He was buried as a Catholic, but by blood, he was 3/4 Jewish. And the Hitler regime, they came to the family and said, either we send you to a nice country club camp where labor is required, or you give back the gold that you have overseas. The Wittgenstein family was pre-German Reich in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the wealthiest family, built on steel.
And that wealth didn't
They were
protect
friends
them.
with Carnegie and so forth.
Yeah. All right.
So I'm just telling you, the governments are evil. And when I look at your politicians in the US, I only see evil and greedy people. They don't care about the people. They couldn't care less. They care about themselves, how much money they can extract out of the system. The budget in America, the government expenditures are $4 trillion a year. Every government, the most honest steals 5%, the most dishonest 100%. The US is somewhere in between. So even if they steal 10% in the US on 4 trillion, it's $400 billion that they steal.
Well, you know, one of the things I appreciate about you, Mark, is your command of the scope of history here. And I know that your comments on what you see today are rooted in patterns that you have seen over and over again with different governments, different regimes, et cetera. And it is very sobering. So again, just to as we begin to wrap things up here, to make things as actionable as possible for people, you know, it sounds like you're saying, look, you see tougher times ahead. You see the government taking a greater share of our wealth through both currency debasement and maybe eventually actually, you know, expropriating it. I remember following your work, you know, right before and right after the global financial crisis. And I think you were still pretty pessimistic back then about our prospects. But you had said, you know, if you got to keep your money in the system somewhere, you got to do something with your money. And I recall that you kind of said, look, if you put a quarter of it in global equities, a quarter in global bonds, a quarter in precious metals. I can't remember if the other quarter was real estate or whatever it was, yes. Real estate. And that actually performed pretty darn well over the past 10 years. Do you have any sort of general framework like that, you know, in the near term for folks to consider? Or is this the time to put it all into precious metals and ideally precious metals nobody knows where they are?
I wouldn't put everything in precious metals because if we look at the performance of assets over very long periods of time, stocks have tended to outperform precious metals.
We hope you've been enjoying this discussion with global macro analyst Marc Faber. The interview continues in part 2, where Mark provides his preferred investments and recommended portfolio allocation for the future he sees coming. To watch part 2, just click on the link provided in the description of this video below, or go to youtube.com/Wealthion. But before you go, please don't forget to hit the like button and then click the subscribe button below if you haven't already, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. It only takes a second and it really helps us out, as the more subscribers this channel has, the more big name experts we can attract on this program in the future. Oh, and if you'd appreciate a free, no strings attached portfolio review by a financial advisor who can help manage your portfolio with the risks that Mark warns of in mind, just go to wealthion.com and we'll set one up for you. Okay, I'll see you over at part 2 of our video interview with the one-of-a-kind Marc Faber.